Hey everyone, and welcome to TableTop with Kevin. In this painting tutorial, I will be showing you how to paint your Orc Boy and the Gretchen as part of your Squighog Boyz model. Now if you were to combine it together with the previous video on how to paint the Squighog, you will essentially be able to complete your entire Squighog Boyz model. So now, let's get started. Now to get my Squighog Boyz tabletop ready and get them done in no time, I like to use mainly contrast paints, but I also will not be touching on any highlights in this video, because I feel that there's really enough depth of color after using contrast paints, and I'm really happy with the results after that. Now in order to prep and prime this model, I'm using Citadel Wraithbone Spray Primer for this. Now how I like to paint my Squighog Boyz, like any other orc, I like to use my favorite combination of using Plaguebearer Flesh and Biel-Tan Green Shade. So for now, let's start using the Plaguebearer Flesh first. When you use Plaguebearer Flesh, don't overload your brush too much and spread it out as thinly as possible. You want just a very thin layer, so once it dries, it has a very thin yellowish color to it. My other suggestion is that you don't want the Plaguebearer Flesh to pool in other areas. In the next step, you actually want the Biel-Tan Green Shade to do that. Now just be careful, you just want to avoid the mouth area as much as possible. But then again, if you make any mistakes, don't worry, we'll try to patch it up later with some Wraithbone layer paint. Now that the Plaguebearer Flesh paint has already dried, now is the time that we can apply our Biel-Tan Green Shade. So when I'm applying the shade, I'm actually a little bit more liberal at this point and let the shade pool into all the nooks and crannies. Now there's only one thing to take note is that once it dries, you may see little yellowish parts of where the Plaguebearer Flesh will kind of like still stand out. So if you do see that, you want to reapply the Biel-Tan Green Shade over it. So basically what you want to have is a very smooth green color across the entire orc skin. Now once you're done, do give yourself enough time for all the shade to dry up. So moving on to the leather portions of the Squighog Boy, I'll be using Snakebite leather for this. Now you want to be a little bit careful at this point and you don't want it to touch the orc skin. Now the leather straps are also a little bit thick, so don't forget to actually paint the sides of the leather straps as well. Now sometimes what I like to do is that I like to use a thin coat of Snakebite leather, and then if it's not enough, I'll actually apply a second coat of the Snakebite leather. Now after letting the leather portions dry, we'll be moving on to the pants area, and I'll be using Space Wolf's Grey for this. Now as you see me paint, you actually realize that one layer of Space Wolf's Grey is not going to cut it. And actually 2 is still not going to cut it, and I actually used 3 layers of Space Wolf Grey just to have good coverage and to give that very nice blue color that really resembles more like denim or more like a jeans kind of color. Now for the next part, I will be using Flesh Terrace Red to color all the other little parts of the Squighog Boy. So in this case, I'm actually painting the headband, the little decorative pieces on the shoulder pads, and even on the kneecap as well. You don't have to use Flesh Terrace Red for this, you can actually use any other colors, but for this case I just find that the little bit of red actually breaks up and adds a very nice variety of colors to the rest of the body. As you can see here, I'm trying my best to be a bit more careful on the shoulder pad area, and I'm trying my best not to have any red paint kind of spill over. Now even if you do make a mistake, don't worry about it, you can always use the Wraithbone layer paint to touch up after that. Now for this Squighog Boy's boots, I'm just using black Templar, and I'll be covering the entire thing with that contrast paint. Really simple. So for the tongue area, I'm using Magos purple contrast paint to do the job. And for this, you might also want to take a really small brush because it's a bit hard for you to put the entire brush into the mouth. Now don't worry if you touch the teeth with some of the purple contrast paint, you can always touch up using the Wraithbone layer paint. Now we've reached the more exciting part of the Squighog Boy model, and that's painting the animal skin coat. Now to be honest, I think it's really up to you on choosing the kind of colors for you to paint the animal skin coat. Here is my thought process on how I chose the colors. So first thing of all, I actually noticed that you have a bit more of the furry type of animal skin, or they have a bit more of the scaly and more reptilian type of skin that they actually use. So for the more furry type, I actually used either Gryph-Charger Grey or Gore-Gunta Fur. Now for the more scaly and reptilian animal coats, I actually use either Gryph-hound Orange or Creek Camo for this. Now for this portion, you realize that those with a little bit more of the spikes and all that, you may have to go a second round of painting in order to get rid of those white spots. Because as you know, they tend to pull away from the sharp edges and it will leave you a very weird whitish looking tips. So you actually have to go a second round just to make sure there's good coverage. Another tip is that for the furs, you don't want it to pull too much into the recesses. As much as it also gives a very desirable effect, you don't want it to pull too much because it will also look very, very muddy and doesn't look realistic in the end. Now for this portion, I'm actually just going to touch up a little bit on the shoulder pads, and I'll be using Seraphim Sepia for this. Now I'm using this shade just to give it a little bit of a more worn out look to the shoulder pads. But as you see here, I'm going it really lightly, just giving a very thin coat on the top so that I don't get to see a lot of the Wraithbone base color, because I think it looks weird. Now if you see any kind of cuts and scratches, I actually do let it pull a little bit in those areas, just to give it a bit more of that dirty feel to it. Now for the teeth, I will be using Skeleton Horde to paint the teeth portion. Now don't overload your brush too much, as you don't want the Skeleton Horde paint to pull too much at the teeth area. If not, he'll basically look like he just swallowed like a ball of mud or something like that. Now for the metals, I will be using Leadbelcher base paint to paint all the weapons and all the metallic areas of the model. Anyway, no contrast paint will ever be able to replace a metallic paint. Now for me, I like to use somewhere between a 1:1 paint to water ratio, but just make sure you have a nice consistency before you paint it on. Always use thin layers, and if it's never enough, you can always paint it over one more time. Now at times, when I feel that there's a little bit too much Leadbelcher or too much silver on all the metallic parts, I like to break it up with a little bit of bronze or bronzy kind of color. So I'll be using Balthasar gold to do this trick. For this, you don't really need very much. Like I said, you're just trying to break it up, all the silver parts, so I'm just going on very small details. After painting all the metallic portions, don't forget to always use some Nuln Oil shade to bring out all the little details of the metal parts. Now that we've completed painting all the boys, we'll be moving on to the Gretchen. And like for the boys earlier on, I'm using a Wraithbone spray primer to prime these Gretchen models. Like the Oxskin, I'll be using exactly the same formula of using Plaguebearer flesh and Biel-Tan green shade. Now just be careful when you reach the mouth area because they're really tiny, but again, if you make any mistakes, don't worry, just always use Wraithbone layer paints to cover it up. You can also see my wife, who's also giving me a helping hand to paint these Gretchen models. Now moving on to the leather portion of the Gretchen models, I'm actually using Snakebite leather for this. Now if you also tend to realize that most of the Gretchen models actually has a kind of a burlap sack kind of a vibe to it. So I'm just basically using Snakebite leather just to, paint everything in one color. Now for the next part, I'm actually using Flash Terror's Red to paint all like the red parts of the Gretchen, as well as those dynamite sticks that's on one of the Gretchen itself. So as you can see on some of the Gretchen, they have like those wristbands or maybe some of those ox symbols. I'm actually using red to kind of like break up the overall greenish and brownish color of the Gretchen. For the sticks of dynamite, do be a little bit careful that you don't touch onto the ox skin. Do try your best to be a bit careful because I think at this portion it's a little bit hard to reach on certain places, but do your best. Next, I'm using Volupus pink for the tongue and for the mini squigs on the squig launchers. For the tongue, try your best to use a really small brush as the mouth of the Gretchen is really tiny. And if you made any mistakes, don't worry, you can always cover it up with Wraithbone layer paint. Now I'm also using the same Volupus pink for the mini squigs, but honestly you could also try to use any other colors to give you a more variety of colors on the Gretchen models. Like you can use Blood Angels red, or you can even use Gryph-Hound orange. Now also take your time and do your best to try to avoid the eye and the mouth area of the mini squigs. And like for all metallic parts, I shall be using Leadbelcher paints to do the job. Now after painting all those metal parts, don't forget to use Nuln Oil to bring out all those tiny details. And lastly, I shall be using Skeleton Horde for all the teeth portions of the Gretchen and the mini squigs. Don't overload your brush for this because you don't want the mouse to be overloaded with too much paint and you don't want the mouse to look really muddy. So there you have it, the completed Squighog Boy and Gretchen. Now don't forget to watch the Squighog video in order to fully complete the Squighog Boyz model. I have attached the link of the Squighog video if you have not watched it yet. Anyway, here are some clips of the models that I've done just for your reference. Now if you think this video was helpful, give this video a like and click subscribe if you haven't done it yet. Lastly, feel free to leave a comment below on what kind of contrast paints and colors that you think might be good for the animal skins that the Squighog Boyz wear. Thank you all for watching and I'll see you next time.